That's good.
All right, welcome everybody to the third lecture for the Bad Catholic's Guide to the Faith. Before we get started, I'm asked the Blessed Virgin Mary, seat of wisdom, to grant me wisdom and us wisdom to hear the truth about her Son. So if you pray with me in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Well, what's nice about this 7 deadly sin stuff is it just seems like it appropriately keeps rolling out wonderfully penchant time. It's like the book knew when we'd be talking about it, because number 3 on the list that I think works perfectly well, we've just started Lent. We're all trying to eat less, except I just realized that I literally violated what I was going to do for Lent because I ate cookies. Thanks, Father. Gee whiz. So, at any rate, the 7 deadly sin that we want to talk about today is gluttony. Man, those lights, you can see gluttony well. Gluttony, and to start off with a rather, like I try to do, a sort of image out of left field about how to consider and think about gluttony. So on the online magazine Crisis, InsideCatholic.com if you want to go to, there was a while ago, actually I remembered it was almost exactly, it was about 2 years ago I think, an article by Jennifer Pierce called Chesterton Was Fat. And as someone who likes Chesterton and someone who can sometimes describe himself as Chestertonian in build, I just thought this would be a good article to read. So, at the time, the person said there was much talk of the possible canonization of one of Catholicism's favorite secular saints. G.K. Chesterton is always someone, especially in America and Britain, that people want to throw out as a really good instance of someone we need to saint and be able to include in the role of the altars. But for Americans, something sits very uneasy with us, and it's just a fact. At one point of his life, in fact the most famous part of his life, all the famous pictures we have, Chesterton was fat. Chesterton was huge, over 300 pounds. They said that when he was giving a speech at Notre Dame on one of his 2 trips to the United States, if it wasn't Notre Dame, no, somewhere in New York, it might have been, what's it, not Fullerton Mary. Anyway, I'm forgetting, but in one of the colleges up north, I think in New York, they didn't have a building large enough to hold everyone who wanted to see Chesterton. So he got up on this balcony, but the only way there was enough room for him in the balcony is he had to sort of wedge himself in this door frame or window frame, and he stood up. He had bad knees, right? So he had to wedge himself so he didn't have all of his weight on his knees. Gave the talk, and was done, and he found out he was stuck and had to pull him out. You know, he's such a big guy. And so for Americans, it's hard to imagine that anybody who was supposedly, weight, we're so materialistic and obsessed with the body that weight is the last sort of indication of whether you have any self-control or not. And I do have to admit in a little bit, people say Chesterton by certain Catholics is seen as sort of like the image of anti-Puritanism, right? He was against temperance, he extolled the goodness of drink and food, in a sheer iconography, if you will, of his largeness, makes some people think of him as a particularly good saint against the Puritanism of America at the time he was alive. But even the Puritanism that we have now, America is so obsessed with the body because they don't think there's any souls. The only discipline you have, because we don't think you need to be disciplined in sex or this or that or drugs, but if you can make yourself skinny, we're perfectly fine with you being like that. And so I have to admit, whether it's just self-congratulation, I sometimes feel good going up and getting seconds and then making a fat joke to make the other person uncomfortable. That's part of the reason why I mention it so much is, it sort of destroys their whole worldview. I'm supposed to be really worried about how I look, and I don't. Now, if I die of a heart attack and my wife's mad, please tell her I'm sorry for me. it's probably not worth it. But I understand what they're saying here with Chesterton. And this Jennifer Pierce says, you know, what devolves into the argument with Chesterton and his corpulence is you sort of get team glutton versus team saint, as she says, and she's making a joke on this whole team Edward and team Jacob stuff that you kids would know what was going on, and I barely do at the time. But the idea was to read either Chesterton as saint or Chesterton as glutton sort of was oversimplifying the issue. Jennifer Pierce was trying to say it gets a little hard to actually simply equate gluttony with eating too much. And it really, this actually is almost like an alley-oop pass to what John Smirak wants to bring up about gluttony, and really helps us, I think, in a timely manner, understand the point of Lent and what is trying to be done. So there are two things that we can know for sure about Chesterton, goes on Jennifer Pierce. One, he was fat, and two, he liked to eat. He liked to drink too. And yet we find ourselves nowhere closer to discovering whether we think he's a glutton or not. Now, it's no surprising that one would link these two together. It seems like you would have to enjoy something if you were going to end up being a glutton. But it's on this point that the author wants to adopt the attitude of Chesterton himself, as he expressed through his flights of grotesque appearances, illusion, and in one of his essays he mentions skeletons for the same way. The idea is that the outside and the inside of a thing don't necessarily agree. The way something appears is not necessarily what it is. Now that is not to say in the old cliche way that all that glitters is not gold, but rather it is to say that the illusion isn't necessarily the outside. The illusion is that there is no inside at all. And that's the problem in considering Chesterton. If he's big, he eats too much, therefore he's a glutton, is the American materialist, reductionist belief that there is no interiority to what we do. And so the author wants to bring up two more things she wants to say with some degree of scientific certainty. One, there are skinny gluttons. And it's funny if you end up being a 31-year-old like me and think about how much you used to eat compared to how much you eat now. At 18, I was far closer to being a skinny glutton than well, who knows? Maybe I'm a glutton at both ages. That's not for me to decide. I can just tell you that an 18-year-old Beau can massacre 31-year-old Beau in an eating contest. Whole large pizzas by himself. You know, when my family went to an all-you-can-eat buffet, we saw it as a challenge, and shop owners cried. Things like this. And yeah, I mean, when we were younger, my brother and I, we had like these three other friends, and we went to, has anybody ever been to Salina, to Coyote Canyon, where you had all-you-can-eat steaks?
Oh, goodness.
All of us had at least over 8 steaks.
Oh.
And that was at least. I think who won was 13. I weighed 140 pounds at the time. So, there are skinny gluttons. And two, there are fat ascetics. I can't speak from experience about this one, but it's true. Though the appearance of the body may have something to do whether we are gluttons or not, it's not the same as saying that it has everything to do with it. And though the mechanics of weight gain seem easy to reduce, calories in, calories out, I think I told you guys last time I signed up for the YMCA, and you can go in and have a trainer tell you, yep, you're fat, and with numbers, and they tell you what you want to do, and they give you the spiel. You have to do this and this and this much exercise if you wanted to lose weight, but if you just cut out, you know, this, that, or the other, eating-wise, it's so much easier. And I was like, I'm going home and drinking a Mountain Dew either way, but thank you. So it's easy to reduce calories in, calories out. If you know anything about biochemistry and thermodynamics, though, there is something peculiarly deceiving in that simple, common sense formula. When a body begins to put on an increasingly dense layer of fat, I always call that my fat sweater, that adipose tissue becomes something like its own organ system. It literally grows its own blood vessels to keep itself alive, and slightly less literally, it grows its own endocrine system to ensure its maintenance and growth. So her physician husband likes to call it the fat parasite. The fat layer secretes hormones, and those hormones ironically make one even more likely to put on fat. And as the hormonal imbalance of obesity continues, it increases cravings and appetites, giving one less and less control over one's eating habits, making you once again more likely to put on fat. Now, really, I'm not reading this as self-defense. There's a point. Just wait. This is not Bo defending his eating habits, I promise. Now, the typical American attitude is uncomfortable with this idea that we're all growing corpulent, and we're quick to judge that anyone who has larger girth lacks self-control. We're equally quick to assume that one who is fat is by definition eating too much, and it is that Puritan inheritance that adds the tone of moral turpitude to the accusation. In the most convenient and general terms, this is correct, but who defines what is enough and what is too little, and what is, as the one golden-locked little girl said, just right? And it's funny to think about people, not quite saints, but getting there. To the founder of the Salim monk order, the monks that are at Clear Creek, Dom Guéranger, I can't say for sure, I haven't seen many full-bodied pictures of him, but I can tell you the man was at least not skinny. The man was at least broad-shouldered, and I think everybody who describes him in the many books has described him as jovial, and I've never heard a skinny person called jovial, so just saying. So she returns to this idea that calories in and calories out is curiously deceiving. She means the full sense of the term curious, the curiosus, full of care, taking pains. The question of obesity and its relationship to gluttony is one that cannot be easily reduced to how large someone is and how they look. This idea about our propensities towards drinking food, it has to be simply different than how someone ends up looking. And it starts to become a profound lesson in how gluttony really works. Because the idea that all gluttony is the showing, really gets at the point of how it is a vice. It's sort of like being concerned with only the exterior is exactly the sort of person that lacks temperance. The gluttonous person can only see things in either a material or exterior way. I know something gives me pleasure this way, I will do it. The sort of interior of the act falls away. So it's highly ironic that people who will look at someone who is fat and only see the girth will not see the randomness that sometimes goes into the actual eating habits of people. So it's funny, a long, lanky man like Chesterton in his youth, and if you see pictures of young Chesterton, he's really skinny. He looks like a basketball player. It's insane. And he may have probably done the same thing and ate even more when he was that small. But the bigger he got, who knows, probably eats even less. Now Jennifer Pierce, her point is to talk about giving levity to the situation, to the talk of whether Chesterton's a saint. But this rolls right into Smirac's talk about gluttony in his book, and how he brings it up in so many particular ways about what we really need to get at when we're talking about what gluttony is. So he says gluttony is a universal human trait. He says it's the thing that binds, it's really diverse, it binds everyone together, it transcends political category, crosses ethnic and ecclesiastical boundaries, and knits together the whole human family in a vast feeding frenzy and drinking game, as he puts it. So everyone from the person who can't scarf down enough to the person who can't stop reading the labels to make sure this is the right organic peanut butter that contains no food heresy. No one seems to be left out. We've all heard of the elegant cliche, as Smirek puts it, less is more, and he says we all know that's crap. More is more. As in, pour me one more for the road. So at first glance it might seem that Christians' strictures on gluttony would be really tight. And you would think this. You would think that hearing about monks who, miraculously only live on eating once a week and things like this, that Christians would be principally understood to be harsh ascetics. But according to the usual hardline St. Thomas Aquinas, what he simply puts it as, we're not supposed to eat or drink anything so much that we make ourselves sick and crazy. Everybody remembers that St. Thomas Aquinas, who we know was a remarkably pure man, and if we're going to assume that he was consistent his whole life, was in no way a glutton, was known as the big dumb ox because of how large he was. So it's already wonderfully ironic how the church, how God chooses which people speak to us. But Thomas shows a lot of levity here. We aren't supposed to eat or drink so much that we make ourselves sick or crazy. And it sounds good, except we go, okay, what does that mean? I mean, we can think about it, right? Don't eat until you throw up. I've probably gotten close to that before, I admit. But usually I don't make myself sick or crazy eating. Drinking, it's probably a little easier to do both of those. And then the use of other things, well, okay, so this is a good guiding principle. But I think that we'd rather have him, be a little bit more precise. Well, faith is not so simple as to act like, don't throw up every time you're done eating. And it's usually not good news to hear to us who want things to be easy and normal. So the angelic doctor actually becomes much more specific about what gluttony consists of. And so Zmirak sums it up probably a little more generalized than St. Thomas would. But what it comes down to is gluttony consists of 5 things you have to avoid. You have to avoid eating or drinking too soon, too expensively, right? Yes. Too eagerly, too much, and then one of my favorites, too daintily. Too soon. What do we mean by this? Zmirak says this is probably made for the benefit of mothers whose kids can't stay out of the kitchen and eating stuff too soon and ripping apart cakes and things like this. But he says, translated for modern Christians, this item of Thomist PowerPoint calls to mind the point at which during a drawn-out 45-minute liturgy, your meditation on the Eucharistic meal gives ways to fantasies of brunch. Behold the eggs Benedict is what he says. If it is too soon, it means can we not order properly our lives and think about food only when the time comes? And if that serves for gluttony, Lent is a primal time. It's almost like Lent induces gluttony. Because how many times do people start talking about the food that they can't have, eagerly yearning for it? It's probably eating it in too soon of a manner, but he also probably means too frequently as well. Too expensively requires a more complex moral calculus, says Zmirak. The church doesn't set down a percentage of your budget that you must spend on food. And what's actually sort of completely backwards in our nation is the cheapest food might be the worst for you and the most likely to cause you to be a glutton. We pointed out before, we live in a strange nation where the poorest among us are most likely to be heaviest because the cheapest food available to them is horrible and terrible. Maybe that's part of one way to look at too soon, as Zmirak will say later, that if your food can be microwaved in 30 seconds, maybe it doesn't have the proper care that goes into it. That's one way to think of it. So expense is not simply that we have a certain, rate that we have to monitor ourselves by, but he makes the something that I know stabs a lot of college kids in the heart. Does your Starbucks, the money you set aside for Starbucks per year outweigh how much you spend on tuition or health insurance or charity or food? You have to think about things like that. Too eagerly seems less of an issue of morals than of manners. Zmirak gives a humble description of his home life and how they used to eat. He said the Zmirak family in 1999 laid out and gobbled up an 8-course Thanksgiving dinner in 17 minutes because he timed it. He knows it was true. I think there's a way in which we think of always eating on the go, eating in front of the TV, multitasking while we eat. This is really hitting home for a lot of us who have a lot of jobs or college students. In a book that was told by a Benedictine abbot to read, St. Benedict Rule in the Family Life, the Benedictine monk goes on and on and on and on, talking about one way families can imitate Benedictines the best is to reestablish family meals as sacred time, to take your time to make the meals, to have wonderful conversation, all these things, to purposely try to make meals again. So it's yet again strange. When we think of gluttony, it would almost seem like eating quickly, on the go and ignoring food would help us be ascetics, but it's actually what contributes to our gluttony. It's actually usually the counterintuitive thing that will make us use the things of earth in a more temperate manner. Keep going on this list though before we get to temperance. Too much is more obvious. As Mirek says, it's patriotic. It's our nation's statistic. But a lot of it, he says, may be more about our sedentary lifestyles than when we actually try to eat. If you get yourself caught in eating contests and things like this regularly, perhaps you know when it goes too much, when we violate health and things like this. But he actually says it's more interesting to think about these other four than to get caught up on the typical American too much. Finally, too daintily, he says this tends to cluster around the upper middle class, though it's increasingly open to anybody else. So this is where he makes fun of foodies who incessantly watch TV shows and decide everybody else on earth needs to learn the difference between Britain salt and Himalayan salt by smell alone. Things like this, he says. And as Mirek puts it, these folks are called foodies, so named because the rest of us would gladly feed them to alligators. So that one strikes a bit too, because Robin and I my wife and I are all pretty proud about cooking stuff. I don't know the difference between those two salts though, so I feel okay. And he says, even if we avoid all pitfalls laid above, he says, according to some common tradition, it would be a sin to eat for pleasure. And this kind of grinds all of us to a halt, because what else do we choose to eat for? And you start to think, all the choices, one of the most common family fights we have, my wife and I, is arguing about where to go eat when we decide we want to go eat out. And it's only a peculiar rite of passage of being a successful nation that has plenty of foods for its people when you can literally say, nothing sounds good. Nothing sounds good. I don't think people who starve would take as much offense that we always eat, but that how much food we disdain. Oh, nothing sounds good today. I've ate so much and so diversely. That probably stings. So, it's incontrovertible that to eat or drink for the mere pleasure of experience, and for that exclusively, is likewise to commit the sin of gluttony. Such a temper of soul is equivalently the direct and positive shutting out of that reference to our last end, which must be at least implicit in all of our actions. We have literally here a direct analog between sex that is contracepted, that shuts off at least the possible natural end of the act, and eating for pleasure alone. Now, what he luckily says is very few of us ever do this, because I don't know about you, I've never been to a vomitorium. And he says if you were a Roman and you would eat to enjoy the stuff and immediately puke it out so you could keep eating, you'd be having a problem. He says, at the same time it must be noted that there is no obligation to formally and explicitly have before one's mind a motive which will immediately relate to our actions to God. It is enough that such an intention should be implied in the apprehension of the thing as lawful, with a consequent virtual submission to the Almighty God. One easy way to do this, and something that I defend as the first step to not eating as a glutton, is to say a blessing before each meal. If you can just manage the bless us, O Lord, and these thy gifts, which we are about to receive from thy bounty through Christ our Lord, amen, you have already made a first step of at least implicitly admitting what this purpose ultimately is. Sure, you might be learning to say it at 100 miles an hour like my little kids all under 5 are doing, and at the whole time you might be thinking about how good the chicken Florentine smells. But if you at least can submit your will to say that, you already start fighting gluttony as eating for pleasure alone. This is the Lord, these are gifts for joy, see by that Christ our Lord. You know, people get really good at that. Blowing through. Okay. So, now Zamira goes on to make the point in a major way with all of this in a very unlikely scenario. He says we're actually gluttons in not so much how we eat the particular food we are ever currently eating. And although that's quite possible, we don't want to rule that out. I don't want this to be like Bo advocating that he's okay with his eating style. But Zmirak, as he's always trying to do by throwing out the deadly sin first and thinking about it in different ways, is to show how actually deep down and rooted a lot of these sins are, and how the virtue arises in a way that's not just simply combating the gluttony. He'll talk about the neurosis here in a second. He says we're actually gluttons not so much in how we eat the particular food, but even more in consumption overall. Our understanding about how we consume things. Like light bulbs. It's one thing to recognize the goodness of property rights and free markets, but it's another thing to praise consumption for consumption's sake, for unbridled use of things. I like to bring up Lactantius, who's a 4th century African Latin apologist. What he has in mind here is in the Republic of Plato. I actually think he sort of misreads the book, but that's beside the point. Plato famously says that one of the cities he's imagining, that everybody should share wives and food and all possessions in common. So he says we need to have this sort of what we call a communist state, I guess. And that everybody should share these things in common. It seems like he's saying that if they share these things in common, they'd be more likely to turn their minds towards things that aren't of the body. Like I said, I think it's a little bit of a misreading, but that's beside the point. Lactantius follows, though, that this cannot be the case. He says, for justice is not expressed in outward conditions, not even in the conditions of the human body. So we start thinking back about, is Chesterton being fat a sign he's a glutton? Justice is not expressed in outward conditions, not even the conditions of the human body, but operates wholly upon the mind. So making men equal is not a matter of abolishing marriage and private property, but of abolishing ambition, pride, and self-importance, of making those self-confident wielders of power realize that they are the equal of beggars. Take from the rich their insolence and injustice, and the difference between the rich and the poor will cease to matter, since they will think themselves as equals, and that is something only religion can achieve. If justice is the mother of all virtues, when you remove individual virtues, you subvert justice. So if you take property away from people, you give them no chance to be frugal or generous or charitable, etc. If you take away marriage out of the hands of people, you take away their ability to be abstinent or faithful or kind. He says ownership of property is the material of virtue and vice. And notice that this is the point. Why does the church defend private property? It's not for the sheer love of capitalism. It's not for the sheer willingness of consumption. It's what private property affords our moral life. The ownership of property is the material of virtue and vice, while community of goods is merely a license for vice. So it's true, people can use private poorly, well or bad. But he says things merely held in common, compelled to hold in common, people will treat like trash. And unfortunately, human beings prove this time and time again. You start getting something to be a public resource, people use it like crap. You have someone privately be interested in it, they'll take care of it better. So he says, men who keep a crowd of mistresses deserve to be called nothing but self-indulgent narcissists. Women who have a queue of lovers are not adulteresses, for a marriage is not in question, but prostitutes and whores. He says, the point being that if you have private property and you use them bad, you can be a thief or a liar or a terrible person. But if you've never been given that opportunity, you will not have the ability to show your worth. So while forcing people to share things in common against or before their will only allows for viciousness, the opposite and virtuous thing is not the total thumbs up for all sorts of consumption. People always want to put things in diametric different camps that really don't speak to the issue at hand. If giving everybody every need they ever has will not work because human beings will take no responsibility for what they do, the opposite and better thing is not simply to say, whatever consumption you want as long as you can get your hands on it. The church has always said we have gifts from God to hold in either communion or as private property for the sake of demonstrating virtue. And that's why we have it. Gluttony is, temperance, which is what's opposite of gluttony, is exactly tested on how we use God's creation. And God gives us bodies to test the virtue of our soul. Gluttony, again, we fall into gluttony when we see only the external good of the thing involved as only a thing to be consumed and not a thing to be used well. So God allows us private property, or at least a particular interaction with things in this world, as a means to prove our virtue and vice. Therefore, most everything in the natural world, the only exception probably is the matter of sexuality, because it involves creating human souls and is thus a desire much more deeper in the fabric of our being. So that's why we deal with lust and continence, and it doesn't fall under gluttony. But every other thing that we react to in the natural world is prone to our ability to use it temperately or gluttonously. And that's exactly the comportment we need to think about. When we think of gluttony, it's not just what fat people do because they can't stop eating fries. It's how do people use things well? How do they use things poorly? So Smirnock actually takes a page out of someone like Wendell Berry and other agrarians. And he says the biggest problem with our food is not necessarily the sheer volume that we pack away, although that's probably the case as well, but that we have become separated from the means in which food is produced. Several people have eaten all run-of-the-mill animals that they've never touched, have never seen, and they use the land and the livestock in a gluttonous way. So for instance, if you combine livestock to unnatural lives, so we can produce whatever the hell a chicken McNugget is, or you exhaust the land in order to make sure everyone has Oreo cookies, you may be eating too cheaply, too quickly, too abundantly, etc. Smirnock puts it best when he says, we've ceased to be stewards of the earth and started acting more like irresponsible short-term renters. Indeed, this hugely elaborate technological attempt to thwart and dominate God's creation is eerily similar to the modern reproductive technology. In the decades when our bodies ache to breed, we dose them into sterility, and when we reach the age when our DNA gives up trying, we call in B-52 bombs on our bodies into conceiving. If liberals would learn to look at contraception the way they do at agriculture, as Smirnock says, they would understand the church's teaching. But conversely, if many of the people who call themselves conservatives and Catholics would look at not gluttony towards food, but gluttony towards creation, they'd probably change as well. And if we look at the monastery, what always bugs liberals, if you will, to put it into just an easy term, is that here's a group of guys or a group of gals that just decide sex isn't going to be that big of a deal and put their energies towards other things. What has always bugged, and I'm using this as broadly as possible, the more conservative minds like Henry VIII and people like this, is monasteries, they're just not using their land properly. Or they're making tons of money and we see none of it. Monasteries and the Christian ideal are offensive to everyone. That's how we know they're a good thing. It pisses everyone off. And if we think about it in ourselves, we look at Christian perfection and realize how it calls all of us to the table. What's more conservative, though, than conserving land? What's more conservative than conserving culture, which agriculture is the first culture there is, etc. Now, to be pointedly fair, Zmirak says it's tiresome to think of these debates in the bipolar way we do, left versus right, etc. Oftentimes, it's simply a matter of stating things better one way or the other. So he says, for instance, to assert animals have rights, so for instance, what are their responsibilities, is very different from saying that it is sinful and sick to treat God's helpless creatures with needless cruelty. We don't need to be going out and giving polar bears voting cards or whatever the hell people act like. We can just say, if you really believe humanity has dominion over animals, that means you are strong and they are weak and you owe them respect. If we are to have dominion over animals, fine, we can use them for the benefit of man, but that does not mean we abuse them for the benefit of man. And any Catholic doctrine where a side is asserted as stronger than a weak side, sure, it admits that the weak will have responsibilities for the strong, but the strong are always called strong for the benefit of the weak. That's why God calls leaders. That's why God makes divisions among people. The natural aristocracy of talents that God throws out in the universe would make no sense, except he says, you have this talent, use it for the benefit of people who do not. If God wanted it to be elsewise, we would all be pretty mediocre at everything, but rather self-sufficient. We are not. We have some strengths, we have some weaknesses. We must depend on each other as an entire group of people to live. Now, the fact that modern folk worry only about whether food makes your figure look this way or that, miss the real point. And they don't really consider gluttony at all. But this is, of course, because we don't usually talk about gluttony in terms of what it's the contrary of, which would be temperance. When you look at a skinny person, no one ever says, like, look at that temperate young lass. They go, oh wow, she's used whatever high-impact yoga and Weight Watchers Extreme to look hot or whatever. It's always about, yet again, another sort of appeal that we're after. So she's forsook the appeal of Snickerdoodle so that she can have the appeal of something else, whether it be power, sexuality, etc. And I don't mean she, men do it too. The P90X and all the supplements we're supposed to take. I don't take them. The only supplement I have is Mountain Dew and beer. Good. Anyway. So Zmirak goes on that some virtues get a bad name because of the way they've been used. I mean, he says temperance, worst of all, gets this thrown into it. This is also a very Chestertonian point. Chesterton, of course, very much hated the temperance movement. And the temperance movement, he says, has ruined the good name of temperance for Catholics all over America. And actually, temperance just in the same way for many other people. When we think of temperance, we think of cinching up our belt in a Victorian way to sort of not just mortify the flesh or show the flesh who's boss, but to completely deny it as if it doesn't matter. So starved of temperance, our souls will slacken and grow flabby, he says, as a body that's overfed and underused. But notice that the main thing that becomes out of shape when we avoid temperance is our souls. Our bodies probably do this as well, but it is not necessarily clear that that's what is overfed and underused. It's our souls that become flabby. This is where he actually talks about the neuroses. So we have the vice, which is gluttony, the virtue, which is temperance, and the neurosis, which is insensibility. You go tell her to be quiet. Insensibility has less to do. So yes, gluttony is not destroyed simply by becoming insensible to other things. Staying alive means answering basic needs of our mortal bodies. We feed our reptilian brains and our reptilian stomachs in order to get everything as we go by. But insensitivity to things, not being able to enjoy the good things of life, does not mean that we've conquered what gluttony has brought to the fore. Gluttony is a protean phenomenon, as Merrick likes to say. It's hard to choose a single exemplar then for temperance. How do we act in a way to forego what is so tied up in our need to use the world well, but is often scattered in easy ways to avoid the discussion? So Victorians and these sort of types that we usually have in mind when we think of temperance movement or temperate people, they want to act like the answer is insensibility. As if outlawing alcohol would make everything work out. And we know how disastrously bad the prohibition movement failed. And Oklahoma singularly benefited on moonshine sales because of the law. We know that acting as if these things do not come about, or that if we can simply avoid the temptation, we've somehow mastered the problem. In The Imitation of Christ, if any of you were doing the preparation for the St. Louis de Montfort's total consecration to the Virgin Mary, this is usually a time a lot of people do this so that they can complete the consecration on the Feast of the Annunciation. Imitation of Christ just brought up that conquering temptation is not simply about avoiding it. We avoid temptation to get a head start. If you are mired in temptation, not just in temptation, if you are mired in a particular habit that is a sin, it's true. You cut it out, you lop off the hand, so that the eye can get into heaven, like Jesus said. But simply avoiding the temptation is not purity. It is not winning the battle. It's not that someday you need to decide when you need to test yourself again, don't get me wrong here. But the actual triumph of good is when your temptation is actually brought back in line with what God intended. And the thing about all temptations is all temptations stem in some way deep at their root from the fact that God has put needs in our souls and our bodies that we must fulfill. The basic ones are the easiest to fail at. We all must eat, we all must drink as a human race, we all must, we must procreate on a special level. Therefore, the three most intense drives all of us have center around food, center around drink, center around procreation. And before the fall, we're held in balance. And since the fall, they are not. Avoiding food, avoiding drink, and avoiding the temptation of procreation does not solve our problem as human beings. We want to get into heaven. We want the Garden of Eden that heaven is the fulfillment of. We do not want heaven to be like a really bland dorm room where nothing ever cool enough happens to make us act bad. And that, unfortunately, is what the answer of insensibility is. And people are right. I think I've brought this up before, but I'll bring it up again. When I go and visit the monastery down at Clear Creek, my Protestant relatives are very prone to say, well, what do you do while you're down there? And I go, well, they just mostly pray. I think I've talked about this before. The monks have never asked me to work. I think it's actually because Father Bethel actually thinks I'm too fat to work, but we'll get to that later. But they've never asked me to work, so I've actually never gone and helped them do anything. I usually go to the prayers. There's usually almost always someone there I know, so I talk more than you probably should in a monastery. And then I read. And I go, well, you pray all day. And they go, you go down to the monastery just to pray all day. was like, sure. And I've had relatives say, well, that sounds boring. And I'm like, well, you got to get used to it, because that's what we'll do in heaven. We're going to pray all day, forever. But it's going to be the best prayer life you ever had. And all these things that we feel for food now, and for drink now, and for beer, and for sexual longing, and all of these things that we feel now are perfected in heaven in the will and the yearning for God that will be constantly fulfilled. So insensibility can't solve anything. Because heaven, you'll hear this when people say, like, well, if people like me aren't in hell, or don't make it to heaven, I want to be in hell anyway. And it's a really stupid thing to say, but you sort of get the point they're making. Is if people make heaven just the place where nobody does anything wrong, they're really missing out on what God's about. Heaven is the place where everything's right. And all these things that we think seem right, and we use gluttonously, it's exactly that we use them wrong. That's the problem. On the other hand, it's not simply the ability to do whatever you want and act like God will take care of the rest. There's this real way that God has given us the actual objects of our existence and a life in which to live, to practice loving the right things, loving them well, and loving them and using them for the right reason. And that's what gluttony ultimately is. It is not the disdain of the created things. It is to prove that a rule can be established over our wills. And if we, as God says, can be trusted in small things, we can be trusted in great things as well. I've got this one asked a lot before. Why? Why not eat meat on Fridays? And I go, it's rule of the church. We try to imitate in some small way what Jesus does. And then they'll be like, getting hung on a cross is like not eating steak. I'm like, well, a little. When you're from Oklahoma and Kansas, so what? And they're like, well, then you don't even do it anyway. You eat fish. Why can you eat fish? I'm like, well, they didn't consider it meat back then. Well, we do now. Why do you eat it now? And it's funny because, Catholics are always called Pharisees, and then I'm getting very Pharisaical, readings of our own law. And the point being is, it just needs to be something. It just needs to be something. The church has ebbed and flowed on what sort of strictures that they've had for Lent. And this blows people's mind. Any time you start talking about things have actually ebbed and flowed in the church. People who are outside of the church and actually good Catholics will blow a gasket. Some parts of the church, in Lent you could eat fowl because they considered that was okay. It was just red meat that was totally prohibited. A lot of places, they only ate one meal absolutely only throughout Lent. Some places literally seem to had you eat only bread and water for all of Lent. They had all these different ways. The monks do something different. The priests, all something different. But of course, the idea is that a rule is established over the desires of our hearts. And that is what's most important. And in the situation you are in, what physical thing can you do to learn to use something better? To use it in a timely manner, in a thriftly manner, in a controlled manner, the right amount, and in the right manner. How can Lent allow us to do that? So another story I ever heard, two postulants entered a monastery at the same time. One was a very poor immigrant who had barely learned to read. He'd taken in by the monks. He's making all this progress, but he comes from a very, very poor family. Another was I think it was an orphan even, an orphan immigrant. And the other monk was the son of a high nobleman. And the abbot, when it came time to eat, the abbot chose what everybody ate in this monastery. And the poor monk noticed that the rich monk got more food than he did, and got better food. That the poor monk got much less. And at first he tried his best not to notice this, but finally it made him so mad that he went up to the abbot and he said, "Abbot, I've been poor my whole life, and to sit here to be undignified, that you would bow to the son of a rich man and give him more and better food than me, it makes me want to leave the monastery altogether." And the abbot said, "But don't you understand, it is you who is rich. This poor kid over here, his entire life has been given whatever he wants. And this plate that I give him, that's much more sensuous than yours, it's all he can stand to give up, and if I did any more, he would leave tomorrow. But you could probably do without even what I give you now. You are the more blessed, because your mind has more control over your body." So it's going to be different. Lent will be different for all of us. I know that we're suffering chronically, if not an actual shortage of priest, at least a shortage of priest time, because we have them doing all sorts of other stuff. But it's very important that insofar as we are possible, we at least ask a priest, or at least another good Catholic, to really think about and rack our brains about what we can do personally that would help us have our mind control our wants a bit. And it's in our day and age, it's not always food. How many of us could even go fast from the internet for a day, let alone all of Lent? TV, talking on the phone, all these various things. What is it that has control of us? What can we do in Lent to establish that our mind and our soul is in charge, and that we can actually put thought into how to use things well? So, John Zmirak throws out, and we'll get into it anyway, he throws out a few people that he says can look at, and a few different people that really do things in quite a few different ways that might be good for us as models of temperance over gluttony. So the first he throws out is St. Benedict of Nursia. So St. Benedict, the founder of Western monasticism, unsettled by the self-starvation, idleness, and hallucinations that afflicted many hermits, and what he thought was the almost too heroic efforts of Eastern monks, Benedict gathered his monks into what he called a school for beginners in learning how to do the monastic life. So he made important things like regular hours of worship, how they would use their days in work, and you go look at the Benedictine rule, and plenty of it talks about having them eat right. They have to eat at least twice daily of healthy variety of foods. It's true, he asked them to stave off of meat as much as possible, but even begrudgingly, he says they could have a tankard of wine each day, because as he says in the rule, Italians can't go without their wine. It's funny, you can almost hear the sarcasm. Given that Benedict's brethren became the leading producers of wine and beer in Europe, this rule must sometimes have been more difficult to keep than chastity. You have all that beer there, and you have to stay off of it. Don Prosper Guéranger, who I've brought up beforehand, so the sort of re-founder of Benedictine monasticism in France after the Revolution. Like I said, Guéranger is not some sort of skinny ascetic that recommended that people starve themselves, and much in line with St. Benedict, what he was more concerned about was to talk about the glory, the near excess, if you will, of Christian worship. Zmirak puts a good quote here to remind us about the importance of Lent. From Dom Guéranger. "The observance of Lent is the very badge of Christian warfare. By it we prove ourselves not to be enemies of the cross of Christ. By it we avert the scourges of divine justice. By it we gain strength against the prince of darkness, for it shields us with heavenly help. Should mankind grow remiss in their observance of Lent, it would be a detriment to God's glory, a disgrace to the Catholic religion, and a danger to Christian souls. Neither can it be doubted that such negligence would become the source of misery to the world, of public calamity, and of private woe." So Lent is not just the hatred of food, and fasting is not sort of some dualistic practice that Catholics participate in, but it's about participating in the divine justice, that spiritual things do not neglect the body, but rule over them properly. The last few to throw out here, like I said, it's Zmirak's twist on trying to think about the totality of gluttony. He throws out Wendell Berry as someone to think about our gluttonous use of technology. How many of us have ever been caught texting to someone who's literally 10 feet away instead of walking over and talking to them? Think about how much power that uses and just how lame that is as a human being, right? How many of us are absorbed by not just electronics, but he even says, how many of us, I remember I lived in Pretty Prairie, Kansas. I lived 3 blocks from my school, and my brother and I drove almost to school. I mean, I think part of that was to be like, hey girls, look at my cool 86 Chevy Cherokee stick shift. But, whatever, still addicted to technology. Is there a way that we can take a step back and realize, as Wendell Berry says, a tool is only good if the cost does not outweigh the benefit? And how many of our tools outweigh the benefit that the cost of them outweighs the benefit that they actually provide for us? Can we think about the gluttonous way that we use the things that are supposed to help us? And then finally, he actually brings up, and this is, I think, funny enough, because I think he wrote this before the movie came out, but he brings up Julia Child. So Julia Child, who, of course, brought back the art of French cooking, and it's good to go watch that movie or just to, go see how bad cooking in the 50s got. Has anybody ever pulled out an old cookbook where, when they first invented microwave ovens, when they were trying to convince you that you could literally switch all cooking to microwaves? Go look up a turkey recipe for Thanksgiving through microwaving it, and look about how the turkey looks when it comes out of the microwave. This was sort of the New World Order that Americans after World War II were being, thrown at. Bland, prepared dishes, promoted by the food industry in the 1950s. And they mostly supplanted a lot of the native and Anglo-American sort of foods local to people. So it was with Julia Child that, of course, this new emergence of actually taking care to cook things came back around. This is a little less important to us because if you come from a poor region of the country and your grandparents didn't have a microwave, they were still cooking family favorites through most of this era. But I've been told by plenty of people that you start talking about how bad their grandmas were at cooking, and it blows my mind. I had one grandma who could not cook, and she was very much this era, right? Use the microwave, use the electric skillet. All the rest of my poor family cook, they should have restaurants, right? Because they cook stuff out of scraps and just crap, right? They can take crap and magically make it wonderful food. So I always like to point out to people, barbecue is the penultimate poor people food because it's all the horrible cuts of meat that you can only eat if you smoke them off the bone. But that's the brilliance of, peasants. And he points this out, right, that cooking is the one art where we almost have the supreme rule of peasants, that almost everything that now is considered wonderful high-class food came from some sort of low-class source. And so American, it's easy to think of, because barbecue anymore costs a lot. But barbecue, like brisket, has anybody ever seen a cut of brisket before it's smoked?
My dad makes it, smokes it himself.
Right, but if you ever see brisket before, it's terrible. I couldn't imagine if you fried it in a pan. It would be disgusting. Ribs is my most, it's just a wonderful example. Used to people would be like, thanks, the rib meat. Right? Who cares? You smoke that puppy for 12 hours, though. Nice. So, gluttony is not so easy to wrap up in a nice package. And when we do, we actually show ourselves to be of gluttonous mind, the worst. If we only look at the outside of the thing, if we only look at the way it appears, if we do not look at how we use things in an interior way, how our spirit and mind orders our body and its use of the natural world. So, thank you, and go eat something now and see if you can do it right.